The night's silence stopped being silent. The silence inside ADX Florence was supposed to be absolute, so heavy and constant that it swallowed every sound before it reached the air. For months, Michael believed silence was the only thing in the prison he could rely on. It never changed. It never faded. It never broke. Until the night it finally did. At 2:14 a.m., Michael woke up to a sound that didn't belong in a supermax prison. It wasn't the rattle of metal, the hum of the lights, or the distant clank of a door. It was breathing, slow, controlled breathing, coming from the vent inches above his bed. He froze, his own breath catching in his throat as the foreign air pulsed through the metal grate, like something alive was hiding in the darkness above him. He pushed himself into the corner of his bunk, eyes locked on the vent, waiting for whatever was inside to move again. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. And just when he convinced himself, he imagined it, a long, thin scrape dragged across the inside of the duct, like fingers tracing a slow warning into metal. Michael's heartbeat thundered in his ears. ADX vents are sealed. Inmates can't reach them. Guards don't crawl through them. Nobody is supposed to be inside those ducts. Yet the sound was unmistakable, intentional, slow, and disturbingly close. He felt dust drift down onto his leg, proof that something had been moving in the darkness above him. Just when he reached the emergency button, a whisper slipped through the vent, soft, calm, and only a breath long. "Don't make a sound." Michael's entire body stiffened. The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't rushed. It was warning him, or threatening him. He couldn't tell which was worse. Then the silence returned, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching him, waiting for him, learning the rhythm of his fear. And that was the moment Michael realized something even more terrifying than isolation. At ADX Florence, the silence wasn't just silence. It was a trap, a routine designed to break you. Michael's first days inside ADX Florence taught him one lesson quickly. Survival wasn't about strength or toughness. It was about routine. A routine so strict, so repetitive, and so predictable that it slowly replaced every thought in his mind. Every morning began before sunrise, when the light snapped on with a cold white glow that never changed. There was no darkness, no easing into the day, just brightness swallowing the room like a command to wake up. Breakfast arrived minutes later, pushed through a steel slot without a single word exchanged. The tray was always the same size, the food the same color, and the guard's footsteps outside the door always followed the exact same pattern. For Michael, the rhythm of those footsteps became the closest thing he had to a clock. Each sound told him the world was still moving, even if he wasn't. The cell itself was a concrete coffin, 7 feet wide, 12 feet long, with a bed built into the wall and a toilet bolted to the floor. There was no softness, no warmth, nothing human about the space. Even the walls felt alive in their own way, vibrating with the distant hum of the ventilation system. Over time, Michael began to memorize the exact texture of every crack in the floor, every chip in the paint, every tiny imperfection in the concrete. To stay sane, Michael developed a routine of his own. He paced the length of his cell exactly 30 times each morning, ran his hand across the wall 3 times before sitting down to eat, and counted his breaths in sets of 10, whenever the silence became too much. These small rituals weren't habits. They were anchors, things that gave him the illusion of control in a place where control didn't exist. But the routine came with a price. The more Michael repeated it, the more he felt it changing him. His thoughts became narrower, more mechanical. Hours slipped by without meaning. Days blurred into each other until he couldn't remember which week he was in, and the silence that wrapped around each routine only made it more suffocating, as if the prison itself wanted to erase the parts of him that didn't belong to the schedule. Then one morning, as Michael waited for the sound of the guard's footsteps, the silence stretched a little too long. The tray didn't arrive on time. The footsteps didn't echo. The routine missed a beat, only for a moment, but long enough for Michael to feel his chest tighten. In ADX, when the routine changes, something is wrong. And for the first time since arriving, Michael realized the silence outside his cell wasn't the same as the silence inside it. When silence starts talking back, silence inside ADX isn't normal silence. It doesn't sit quietly in the background the way silence does in the outside world. Here, silence becomes its own sound, thick, heavy, and impossible to ignore. After weeks alone, Michael started realizing the silence felt different at different times of day. In the morning, it felt distant. In the afternoon, it felt tight. But at night, it felt almost alive, like it was pressing against the walls to get closer to him. He began hearing things he wasn't sure were real. Soft echoes that didn't belong to any guard or inmate. A faint clicking sound in the distance, too slow to be machinery. Sometimes a whisper that could have been the vents, or could have been something else entirely. The longer Michael stayed inside ADX, the more he understood that silence was never truly empty. It was a space waiting to be filled by whatever his mind couldn't control. To cope, Michael counted the hum of the fluorescent lights. They buzzed at a steady rhythm, one of the few sounds he could trust. But even that became strange when he noticed the hum sometimes shifted pitch, almost like the lights were reacting to something moving somewhere deep inside the prison. He tried to ignore it, but the shift was too deliberate, too precise. Silence was beginning to show patterns. At night, when the world outside faded and the lights inside dimmed slightly, the silence changed again. It wasn't peaceful the way quiet should be. It felt more like anticipation. Michael would lie on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, waiting for some sound to interrupt the tension. And eventually, something always did, a creak in the duct, a faint patter above the concrete, or a soft vibration in the wall behind him. Michael realized that the silence inside ADX was not something you escaped by closing your eyes. It followed him into sleep. It shaped his dreams. It waited for him the moment he woke up. The silence wasn't a break from noise. It was a reminder of how alone he was, and how much of his sanity depended on tiny sounds most people never notice. But one night, the silence didn't just feel different. It sounded different. Something new entered it, a presence he couldn't explain and couldn't ignore, the mind that tries to escape itself. The longer Michael stayed inside ADX, the more he realized the real prison wasn't the concrete walls. It was his own mind. At first, he tried filling the hours with counting, pacing, breathing exercises, anything that gave him structure. But the silence made every thought echo louder. His memories became sharper than the walls around him. Every mistake he ever made replayed like a movie he couldn't turn off. Days blended into each other until Michael couldn't tell Monday from Thursday, morning from afternoon, or even dream from reality. He'd catch himself staring at the same spot on the wall for 10 straight minutes without remembering why. Sometimes he woke up convinced someone had spoken his name, only to realize the cell was just as silent as it had always been. The mind doesn't like emptiness. And in ADX, emptiness is all you have. He tried creating imaginary conversations just to feel human again. He would whisper questions into the darkness and answer them in a different tone, pretending someone else was there. It helped for a while, but after days of doing it, even he couldn't tell which voice was really his. In ADX, talking to yourself wasn't a sign of losing sanity. It was a sign of trying to keep it. One of the worst changes came when Michael lost track of time. Without a clock, without sunlight, without noise, minutes stretched into hours. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps, but they were just echoes of his heartbeat. Other times he felt like hours had passed, only to see that breakfast, lunch, and dinner trays had never arrived. Time had become another inmate, one that controlled him more than the guards ever could. Eventually, he started hearing things, his name, faint whispers, small clicks and events. He tried telling himself it was the building shifting or his mind filling in the silence, but deep down he knew the sounds were too deliberate, too human, too close. And when they came at night, they always came after the silence held its breath, like the prison was waiting for him to notice. By the end of his 3rd month, Michael feared something worse than isolation, the possibility that someone or something was experiencing the silence with him. The guards who knew but never spoke. The guards at ADX were trained to be silent, emotionless, and controlled. But after months inside, Michael began noticing small cracks in their armor. These cracks didn't come from anger or impatience. They came from fear. Some guards moved faster than usual past certain cells. Others avoided looking inmates in the eye. And a few, the newer ones, seemed to flinch every time a vent rattled or the lights flickered unexpectedly. It wasn't the inmates that frightened them. It was the building. Michael started paying attention to the guards' faces. The older guards, the ones who had worked ADX for years, had a hollow expression, like they'd seen things they weren't allowed to talk about. Their eyes scanned the ceiling more than they scanned the cells. Their posture stiffened whenever they passed a vent. And one guard in particular, a tall man with a shaved head, always walked faster on Michael's tier, as if trying to avoid staying too long. During food rounds, Michael noticed that some trays were delivered quicker than others. The guards almost tossed the tray into the slot, refusing to stop or lean forward. At first, he thought it was just part of their routine, but after watching closely, he realized something unsettling. They rushed past the cells where the strange sounds were loudest. The cells where the silence felt wrong. The cells like his. It became obvious the guards knew something the inmates didn't. Something they couldn't say, even if they wanted to. They never made eye contact. They never paused long enough to answer a question. And sometimes, when events groaned loudly at night, Michael swore he heard guards talking in urgent whispers just outside his door, their voices low, tense, almost panicked. One day, a guard dropped a folded sheet of paper through his food slot. Not a note, not a message, but a printed memo titled, Ventilation Restriction Protocol. The instructions listed emergency steps for unexpected movement, pressure changes, or unauthorized access. Michael didn't know what unauthorized access meant, but nobody should be accessing ADX vents. Ever. It was the final confirmation he needed. The guards weren't protecting the prison from the inmates. They were protecting the inmates from something inside the prison. The first night, Michael lost control of time. Time inside ADX Florence wasn't just slow, it was broken. The days didn't feel like days, and the nights didn't feel like nights. The dim lights inside Michael's cell never fully turned off, so his body stopped understanding when to sleep and when to wake. At first, he tried counting hours based on when meals arrived, but the prison didn't always deliver food at the same exact minute. Sometimes breakfast came early, sometimes dinner came late, and sometimes the gap between meals felt impossibly long. One night, Michael lay down on his bunk to rest his eyes, just for a moment. When he opened them again, he wasn't sure if 30 seconds or 3 hours had passed. The lighting hadn't changed. No tray had appeared. No footsteps echoed outside his cell. His body felt awake, but his mind fell half asleep. Time had slipped away, as if the prison swallowed it silently while he was blinking. The next day wasn't any better. Michael tried pacing to keep himself grounded, but halfway through counting his steps, he forgot which number he started with. He tried doing push-ups, but somewhere between the 15th and 20th, he forgot how many he'd actually done. He even tried talking to himself to stay alert, but his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, distant, echoing back at him through layers of concrete and emptiness. Then something stranger happened. While staring at the wall, he saw a shadow move across the floor, slow, almost hesitant. But the shadow didn't match anything inside the cell. It wasn't his. It wasn't shaped like a guard. And it didn't come from a hallway. It started near the vent and slid across the concrete, like a hand reaching out from the ceiling. When Michael blinked, it was gone, but the feeling it left behind stayed lodged in his chest. By the end of the week, Michael wasn't sure if the prison was confusing him on purpose or if he was losing himself to the silence. In ADX, the walls don't talk, they listen. They wait. They feed on moments when the mind slips. The more he fought to stay present, the more the building seemed to blur the lines between night and day, thought and reality, silence and sound. The worst moment came when Michael heard a soft knock on his cell door, a single tap. He rushed to the door slot and looked through the narrow opening. No guard, no inmate, no shadow, only silence. The recreation cage that feels like a trap. Every inmate at ADX Florence gets 1 hour of recreation a day, though the word doesn't mean what people think. Recreation isn't a yard or a field, or even a place where you can see the sky clearly. It's a concrete box outside the cell, barely bigger than a walk-in closet, covered by thick metal fencing. The only hint of the outside world is a thin slice of sky above, like someone took a razor blade and cut open a tiny wound in the ceiling. For Michael, rec time was supposed to be freedom, a chance to stretch, breathe different air, feel sunlight if the weather was kind. But even that hour became something he dreaded. Every sound echoed weirdly inside the cage. Footsteps, breathing, even the slightest movement. It was as if the concrete walls were listening to him, repeating his noises back in distorted whispers. The air felt heavier outside than inside, which made no sense, yet he felt it every time. The guards watching wreck time were more alert than usual. They kept glancing at the far wall, checking vents, whispering into radios. Their behavior made the wreck cage feel more like a target zone than a break. Michael noticed that when he stood under certain spots, guards stiffened and moved closer. When he backed away, they relaxed. They weren't watching him. They were watching something else. One day, while walking slow circles in cage, Michael heard something disturbing, a faint rhythmic tapping inside the concrete wall. It wasn't coming from another inmate. It wasn't coming from pipes or machinery. It was coming from inside the structure, behind layers of concrete that no human could reach. The tapping followed his footsteps like a weak heartbeat echoing from the wall itself. Then something else happened, something he couldn't explain. The air inside the wrecked cage shifted suddenly, like a gust brushing past him, but there was no wind. Michael turned quickly, expecting to see a guard behind him, but the guard wasn't even looking at him. Instead, the guard stared at the vent above the cage with eyes full of dread. Michael didn't know what was inside that vent, but the guards did. By the time wreck was over, Michael felt more trapped outside the cell than inside it. Something about the cage wasn't right. Something about the air, the walls, the vents, all of it felt like a warning. The night the lights wouldn't stay still. Lights inside ADX Florence rarely flicker. They're industrial grade, designed to stay on day and night, maintaining the same cold glow that keeps inmates awake and aware. But on Michael's 129th night, the lights began behaving in a way that felt almost intentional. They dimmed for a second, then brightened too quickly, casting sharp shadows across the cell. Then they dimmed again, longer this time, as if something was interfering with the circuit. Michael pushed himself off the bunk, staring at the ceiling. Light changes inside ADX were not normal. Every system in that building was controlled, monitored, and checked by engineers who rarely made mistakes. But tonight, the flicker wasn't mechanical. It felt rhythmic, pulsing, almost like a signal, a slow beat, a countdown. Something was trying to communicate, and the lights were answering. As the flickering continued, the room began to feel smaller. The shadows became deeper, darker, and more distorted. Each time the lights blinked, the shadows shifted in ways they shouldn't. Michael rubbed his eyes, thinking he was tired, but the shadows didn't stop. They stretched across the walls, climbing upward, slithering past a vent. For a moment, Michael thought he saw someone standing in the corner of the cell, silent, still, waiting. But when the lights steadied, the figure was gone. The entire tier reacted. Michael heard metal beds creak in neighboring cells. He heard someone whispering prayers under their breath. Another inmate begged the guards to turn the lights back on fully. Footsteps rushed across the hallway, but not toward the cells, toward the electrical panel at the far end of the tier. Guards spoke quickly into radios, their voices low, urgent, and filled with confusion. Then the lights went out completely. For 3 long seconds, ADX Florence, one of the most secure and heavily monitored prisons in the world, fell into total darkness. No hum, no glow, no sound except the sharp rise of inmate breathing echoing through the concrete. When the lights finally returned, Michael found himself gripping the edge of his bed so tightly his knuckles were white. That was the moment he realized something terrifying. The prison wasn't malfunctioning. It was reacting, responding to something inside it. The guards who finally broke character. For months, Michael watched the guards move like machines, silent, stiff, emotionless. ADX officers were trained to show nothing, say nothing, reveal nothing. But after the night the lights failed, their behavior shifted in a way that was impossible to hide. Their posture was tight. Their hands shook when they held their keys. Their footsteps moved faster than usual, echoing down the hallway in sharp bursts instead of steady rhythm. Something had rattled them, something deeper than any inmate could cause. Michael knew it was serious when the tier's supervisor, a man who rarely spoke, paced up and down the hallway muttering into his radio. He stopped at every vent with a flashlight, shining the beam inside as if expecting someone or something to look back. The fact that he checked the vents instead of the cells said everything. Whatever the issue was, it lived inside the prison's walls, not inside the inmates. During morning rounds, another guard accidentally dropped his food tray cart. Trays scattered across the floor, clattering and rolling down the hallway. Instead of laughing or cursing, the guard froze. He didn't pick them up. He didn't move. He just stared at the ceiling vent above Michael's cell, breathing hard, his entire body trembling. Michael called out softly, asking if he was okay. The guard didn't respond. He only stepped away slowly, like someone backing away from a sleeping animal. Later, Michael heard two guards arguing in hushed, frantic voices near the electrical panel. He couldn't make out everything, but he caught fragments. "It's moving again. Check the upper ducts. No, I'm not going alone." These weren't men afraid of inmates. These were men afraid of what the prison itself was doing. ADX was built to control every variable. But something was happening the system wasn't designed to handle. By midday, guards started walking in pairs. No one did solo rounds anymore. Even the veteran officers, the ones who used to stroll casually down the hallway, now kept their backs to the walls, as if expecting something to drop from the ceiling. Radios buzzed constantly with updates and warnings. Something had changed overnight. Something big. Something they couldn't hide from the inmates any longer. For the first time since arriving at ADX, Michael wasn't scared of guards. He was scared with them. Because if the staff was afraid, that meant whatever they feared had no limits. The second inmate who went silent. Torres wasn't the only inmate who disappeared. The silence that followed his vanishing felt wrong, but some inmates convinced themselves it was a transfer, a medical pull, anything normal. But when Parker in cell 209 suddenly stopped answering roll call, every man on the tier felt the tension snap like a wire pulled too tight. Parker was always loud, always talking, arguing, knocking on walls to get attention. He wasn't the type to go quiet willingly. And yet, one morning, there was nothing. Not a sound. Not a cough. Not even breathing. Michael listened closely through the concrete, pressing his ear against the cold wall. He expected Parker's usual sarcasm, a whispered joke, even a groan. But the wall stayed dead. Hollow. Empty. And emptiness in ADX meant one thing. Parker wasn't in that cell anymore. But the terrifying part wasn't that he vanished. It was that no one came for him. No shackles. No guards. No movement. Just absence. When the guard did rounds, Michael watched carefully. The officer placed trays on every food slot, except Parker's. He didn't pause. He didn't check. He simply walked by as if cell 209 no longer existed, as if Parker had been erased from the system. ADX doesn't make clerical mistakes. If a cell goes quiet, guards investigate. But not this time. This time, they pretended nothing was wrong, and that was the loudest warning of all. By afternoon, whispers spread through the tier. Some inmates claimed they heard scraping near Parker's cell the night before. Others swore they heard coughing from inside the vents, coughing that traveled through the ducts and disappeared suddenly. Michael didn't know what to believe, but he did know one thing. The pattern was undeniable. First Torres, now Parker. Both cells directly under major ventilation lines. The disappearances weren't random. They were connected. Michael's skin crawled as he replayed the warning scratched behind his toilet. Don't look up. Whatever was inside the walls wasn't just moving. It was choosing, watching, waiting. And now it had taken a second inmate, without leaving a trace. The silence wasn't just dangerous anymore. It was predatory. That night, Michael lay awake, staring at the vent above him. Because if two men had vanished under the same ventilation path, there was no guarantee he wasn't next. The message that should not exist. The morning after Parker vanished, Michael noticed something strange behind his toilet. At first, he thought it was a crack in the concrete, a jagged line that hadn't been there before. But when he leaned closer, his stomach tightened. It wasn't a crack. It was writing. Deep scratches carved in the wall with something sharp, Something metal. Something no inmate inside ADX should ever have access to. His heart raced as he traced the letters with his fingertip. Don't look up. He froze. The same warning. He saw the night Torres disappeared. The same message scratched by a hand desperate enough to carve through concrete. But this time it wasn't old. The dust was fresh. The edges sharp. Someone or something carved it while Michael slept. That was impossible. ADX cells locked from the outside. Doors don't open outside scheduled routines. No inmate or guard should ever get inside his room without him hearing it. Michael stepped back, heat rising in his chest. His eyes shot to the vent above his bed. The metal grate was slightly bent, just enough to notice if he stared long enough. He hadn't noticed it before. Had it always been that way? Or did someone push it aside last night while he slept? He didn't know what terrified him more, the idea that a guard entered a cell without speaking or that something entered from the vents instead. For the next 2 hours, Michael sat in the corner, watching the vent like it was a doorway to another world. Every small creak in the ductwork made him flinch. Every gust of air through the metal slits felt intentional, like breath. The warning on the wall wasn't a message. It was a command. Not from an inmate, not from a guard. From someone who knew the vents better than any human could. He tried pressing the emergency call button on the wall, but nothing happened. The light didn't blink. The speaker didn't activate. The system was dead. A deliberate shutdown? Or another sign that whatever was happening inside ADX wasn't under anyone's control. Michael realized something horrifying. He wasn't being warned about what was happening in the hallway. He was being warned about what was above him. And the vent above his head suddenly felt less like a part of the building and more like a mouth waiting to open. The ceiling that shouldn't move. By the next night, Michael's fear had shifted from a message on the wall to something worse. The ceiling itself. ADX Florence was built like a bunker. The vents don't move. The concrete doesn't shift. Nothing in that room is supposed to change. But as he lay frozen on his bunk, staring at the vent above him, he saw something impossible. The metal grate pulsed. Not shaking, not rattling, pulsing, like something behind it was breathing in slow, steady patterns. At first, he thought exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but the more he watched, the more obvious it became. The vent wasn't reacting to the air system. It was reacting like a living thing, expanding slightly, contracting slightly, enough for the shadows around it to throb softly. He didn't want to blink because blinking meant losing track of whatever might move next. Every instinct screamed at him to look away. Every inch of his body refused. Michael slowly sat up, inching closer to the vent without making a sound. His breath felt stuck in his chest. The silence in the cell was so deep, he could hear his own pulse in his ears. Then something inside the vent scraped lightly, a slow metal drag that followed the pulsing rhythm. It wasn't random. It wasn't mechanical. It was deliberate. Someone or something was shifting its weight little by little, preparing for movement. When Michael pressed his hand against the wall beneath the vent, he felt a faint vibration, soft but unmistakably real, like fingertips brushing the metal on the other side. His skin crawled. If something was in the vent, it wasn't crawling quickly like an animal. It was moving slowly, intentionally, like it was testing the structure, learning the cell layout piece by piece. The breathing, the scraping, the dust, all of it pointed to a presence inside the ducts. He tried calling for a guard, but no one answered. His voice echoed back at him through the concrete, swallowed by the silence, as if the prison itself refused to acknowledge the fear building in the cell. He wondered whether the guards even knew what was happening inside the walls, or if they were pretending not to because they couldn't stop it. ADX was built to contain the most dangerous men in America, but nothing in its design accounted for danger coming from above. The realization hit him, so suddenly he felt cold all over. The vents weren't just breathing. They were listening. The guards who stopped hiding their fear. By the time another morning arrived, the guards were no longer pretending everything was normal. Their footsteps were too quick, their eyes too wide, and their hands too tight on their radios. ADX guards were trained to show no fear, no hesitation. They were the final line control, in the most secure prison in America. But today, they acted like the building itself had turned against them. They checked vents before cells, corners before inmates, and ceilings before anything else. Something had shifted overnight, and whatever the guards saw, it terrified them. Michael watched one guard freeze mid-step as a faint metallic ping echoed through the ducts. The man's whole posture changed, stiff, cautious, almost trapped. He looked up at the ceiling as if expecting something to fall from it. When the noise repeated, the guard instinctively backed away from Michael's cell. Guards never retreat from inmates, but they were retreating from the vents now. That single behavior told Michael everything. They weren't in control anymore. During midday rounds, a different officer held a laminated yellow sheet, something Michael had never seen before. It was titled, Ventilation Emergency, Level 2 Response. The guard tried hiding it under his arm, but a gust from the hallway vent blew a corner upward just long enough for Michael to read a line. If movement is detected, do not approach alone. He felt his stomach twist. ADX protocol only used levels for riots, escapes, or lethal danger, never for movement. Later, Michael noticed guards checking cameras pointed at ceilings instead of doors. The monitors flickered constantly, like something kept interfering with the feed. One guard swore under his breath and slapped the side of the monitor, only for the screen to show a blurred shape passing across a duct before cutting out entirely. He looked over both shoulders, then quickly shut the system down. Michael had never seen a guard shaken like that. Voices carried through the hallway, tense whispers, rushed orders, close sector doors, seal the upper vents, call maintenance. But none of it sounded like protocol. It sounded like desperation, like the kind of orders you give when you're trying to contain something you don't understand, something you don't want the inmates to notice. But Michael already had. For the first time since the strange event began, Michael realized the truth. The guards weren't hiding the danger from the inmates. They were hiding the danger from themselves. The silence that never lets go. By the time Michael reached his final months inside ADX, he understood something that most people on the outside will never accept. Silence can be louder than violence. Inside the world's most secure prison, noise is controlled, movement is controlled, time is controlled, but silence becomes its own force. It creeps into your thoughts, rearranges your memories, and rewrites the parts of you that once felt unbreakable. ADX didn't need chains to hold him. The silence did all the work. When the guards changed their behavior, when inmates vanished without sound, when patterns inside the vents shifted with purpose, Michael realized ADX wasn't just a prison built to contain danger. It was a place that amplified it. A place where isolation didn't just keep inmates separated from the world, it separated them from themselves. Every breath felt monitored. Every second felt watched. Every shadow felt like it had a pulse. And somewhere inside all that silence, something else was alive. Whether it was fear, paranoia, or something moving to the walls, Michael never fully understood. But he knew one thing for certain. The building wasn't just responding to inmates. It was reacting to them, learning them, studying them. ADX Florence was supposed to be unshakable, immovable, a perfect system of control. But Michael had seen enough to know the truth. Even a perfect system can hide imperfections. What frightened him most wasn't the disappearances themselves. It was how quickly they were forgotten, how easily entire cells became invisible, how guards avoided answering questions not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. Whatever was happening in the vents, behind the walls, or under the floors, it was something nobody wanted to admit was real. Silence made it easy to pretend. Silence made it easy to erase. When Michael was finally transferred out, he expected relief. But silence followed him like a shadow. It lived in his ears. It lived behind his thoughts. Every small noise made him flinch. Every gust of air made him look up at the ceiling. The world outside felt too bright, too loud, too fast. ADX had changed him. It had taught him that the most terrifying part of isolation isn't being alone. It's realizing you might never stop feeling watched. And even now, long after leaving the concrete walls behind, one thought still haunts him whenever a room falls quiet. What if the silence inside ADX wasn't created by the prison, but by something living inside it?